Tuning in to Minds of Tomorrow. I'm your host, Luis Acevedo, and with me today I have Dr. Jenny Martin. She has her PhD in psychology. She is the host of Why Didn't I Know podcast, and her focus is mainly on female sexuality. And so, Dr. Jenny Martin, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you, Luis. Good to be here.
Awesome. So could you tell us a little bit about yourself? Maybe a brief introduction and how you got into this line of work?
Sure. Is there anything specific that you'd like to know?
Yeah, so as far as you getting your PhD in psychology and focusing in sacred sexuality. So what were the, how did you get there? If you can just give us like a concise version of that.
Sure. It's actually EDD. It's doctorate in psychology.
Okay.
And I did go further and study sexual education. But as I said on my live stream yesterday, I don't follow what the mainstream sexuality education is all about. I think that it is a little woke for me. And I do believe that there is information out there that's not being taught in universities. And the Why Didn't I Know whole name is about the fact that there is a lot of information. I think people are waking up to this right now, right? We're not told the truth by the news. The news is lying. And Joe Rogan really told us about that this week, right? Wonderful that he said that to all of his huge audience, that the media doesn't tell you the truth. And this didn't start in the era of Trump. This started way back. Whoever writes history shapes the narrative, but whoever is in the journalism profession, the media, is further consistently shaping that. And a lot of times it's untrue. So what has been happening with this whole pandemic, and we're not going to go in and talk about that, but there's this constant sense that we have to live in fear, that we're fragile beings, we could get sick at any moment. And that is such a distortive narrative. And what I'm interested in is sharing information that really speaks to how profoundly powerful we are, how much capability we have. And I did start out my journey coming from just a spiritual perspective, but because I actually have a real interest in science, and I have people that in my life, I live in Seattle, Washington, and it's probably one of the most secular places around. There's a lot of people that are not really interested in speaking about something from a spiritual perspective. So you have to be able to actually back it up with some scientific information. Now, I know science has got a bad rap because really you can quote research just like you can quote the Bible to try to back up anything that you want to say. But there is research out there that hasn't been talked about. At least I never heard it in college. I had to go and do further study on my own and spending time in university libraries to try to piece together a narrative about sexuality that isn't talked about, and also about female sexuality. And it's very empowering. It's very empowering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it certainly is. And that's, one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you on the show. I wanted to have you on the show is because I think there's been this for years now, this sort of suppression of the feminine as far as sexuality goes. And I think you touched on something pretty important there very briefly, and that's the woke movement that's taking place right now. So if you can go into that a little bit as to why you don't buy into it and why it's wrong in your opinion.
That's such a huge topic. What element of wokeness would you like to discuss?
Yeah, so I guess to keep it in the context of what we're talking about today, I guess we can touch on, I would say, the rise of promiscuity and also the feminist movements, where it's, an attempt for equality, they say, but in reality, it's trying to supplant the man. That's sort of like it's a battle of sexes is what is, taking place in the wokeism. Whether you have the men who, you have some men who are like, women are trying to, take us over. And then you have women who are trying to, are just, very involved in these feminist movement. I think it's like the third wave feminism is what some people are calling it.
Well, I will say part of the suppressed information that we don't learn about in school is that there have been cultures in the past where there has been a different balance of power, more egalitarian. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is that when it's not a patriarchal government, when it's not a patriarchal society, which we have now, when it's more egalitarian, not that women are ruling over men, but that there's more of a balance of power. Sexuality is not restricted. It's not. So now we have this kind of puritanical culture, right? I don't know if you were around when Janet Jackson had that wardrobe malfunction a while back, right? At the halftime during the Super Bowl. And like the whole country was just like, oh my God, her boob showed, but it had like a pasty thing on it. Like people were freaked out, right? But at the same time, there's this guy that wrote this book called America Unzipped. He's an MSNBC columnist on sexuality. And he was getting all these letters from people that were talking about these like really like bizarre things that they were doing in their private life sexually. And so he traveled the country documenting what people were doing. And he found out that Americans, they will say in public, oh, that's totally wrong. But in private, they're like having like mass orgies, or they're going to like S&M bars, BDSM places. Like they're doing like wild stuff, right? And that, and some of it is like, I would say it's really taking us away from the possibility that sex really presents to us, because in my personal belief, when you add pain and violence to sex, you don't have the possibility of getting to the psychedelic state, which I talk about in my classes. It's just the opposite of what the nervous system, there's a whole science to it, and it's not going to trigger the same type of psychedelic state. It'll trigger a disassociated state, but not a psychedelic state, in my opinion, from reading the research and also from working with people and so forth. But when you have a puritanical attitude in a country like we do about sex, I grew up in Ireland. Ireland was very suppressed, but there are parts of Europe that haven't been that way. Quebec, for instance, I used to live in Canada. It's very different. For instance, when you swear in Quebec, you don't say fuck, you say tabernacle, which is the Eucharist. So they have a much more relaxed idea about sex, and they just have a whole different view of it. But what I'm trying to say here is that when there is a different type of balance of power in a culture, there is less of a puritanical, there's less of this tug of war between, oh, we have to look like we're not interested in it all, and we would never cheat on our wife, or we'd never do anything like that, right? Never look at a porn site. But at the same time, there's like child trafficking going on, and sex trafficking is more of an epidemic than it's ever been in the world today, right? So there's this juxtaposition that's happening. There are cultures in ancient history. Now, not everyone's going to believe this because it's not reported in the mainstream education, but I follow Peggy Sanday's work, who's an anthropologist from University of Pennsylvania, and she's done detailed research on this. There are civilizations who had no rape, who had no sexual violence. And interestingly enough, it's not that they held sex as bad. It's not that they had this puritanical attitude. Quite the opposite. Sex was celebrated. In fact, there's a ritual called Hieroskamos that would be celebrated where two people have sex in front of a whole community. And so it was very sacred, almost like doing a ayahuasca ceremony with a shaman, right? So there was a sacred sacramental aspect to sex. There was certainly pornography. There were naked pictures of women, but it was the female body was seen as the portal to the divine, right? And the last known, well, one of the civilizations that had this was in Crete 5,000 years ago, in, the island of Greece. And, women walked around with these outfits that their breasts showed all the time, right? And men walked around with these outfits where their private parts were really exposed, right? In these tight-fitting costumes. And you would think, oh my gosh, if we're thinking about how the Taliban looks at things, right? Women have to have just like their whole body covered, or else there could be some kind of like compulsion for a man to rape them. That's bullshit. It's totally wrong. Because if you look at these other cultures where there was this free expression of sex, there wasn't rape. She wrote her book called Male Domination, and I can't remember the total title, but it's Peggy Sanday. And what she wanted to show is that when you have a more permissive sexual society where the female sexuality is honored in a divine way, that it actually accesses the divine, this whole thing about rape and sexual violence doesn't happen. And there's this meme going around on Facebook right now where some of the women I know are reposting something. And the essence of it is that when there is sexual violence, sexual abuse, rape that happens in culture, it's never pointed out that it's a man that does it. And there's kind of this, like, we should get on men, like men are the reason this is happening. And if I ever see that, I always post underneath and I say, guys, that's not true. It is not men that are the problem. Now, I realize what I just said, there are men that are advocating for the opposite. So there's a book, Rape is in the title. I can't remember what the rest of it is, but it's by two MIT guys. It was put out by MIT Press. And they're advocating for the fact that rape is evolutionary and men it's part of their DNA to want to do this or to have to do this. And what the woman that I follow, which is at University of Pennsylvania anthropologist, she's saying that is bullshit. That is not true. Because if I can identify one society, the last being the Minangkabau people in Indonesia, she went to live with them for 13 years. And they were industrialized society. You go to university, get a PhD there. I mean, industrialized society. They didn't have rape up until the internet came in, right? Then it changed. But when she lived there, there was only like 3 rapes in 13 years. 2 of the people suicided themselves because it was so dishonoring to actually have done that in their culture. This is a culture of 3 million people. And the other one, the people just ran him out of town. He was actually a foreigner. So women celebrated their sexuality. It was a wonderful thing when you started your period, right? It was a celebration. Women were very sexual. They initiated sex, right? It wasn't that, oh, women don't really like sex and it's a man thing. That wasn't the way with those people before the internet shaped their thinking. And it just goes to show, Peggy Sanday's point was, if there is one culture ever in the history of the world that this whole idea of assault didn't happen, then it goes to show men do not have this inherently in them. It is the culture, and I do believe that women are partly responsible for this too. And I spoke a little bit about that on my live stream yesterday. But so you asked your question about permissiveness or promiscuity. I see that in a very different context. It's not like I'm like, okay, yeah, go out and do anything you want. But I'll just say this. When I first got my degree, I looked at some of the research out there about porn addiction and sex addiction, and I ended up getting wrapped up in a further postgraduate study by Patrick Carnes, who runs like the quintessential sex addiction therapy training for therapists. And I went through part of that training, CSAT training. It's actually Christian oriented too, right? And so you get listed on their website as a Christian CSAT therapist. And so I had men calling me, and then I would do the Skype and talk to them. Now, most of the time, the people that were talking to me, their wives had given them an ultimatum. I am going to take the kids and leave if you don't get help for this and stop looking at porn, right? And so they'd be on the Skype with me, and I had to go through this protocol that I had learned. And I realized this isn't where my heart is, and this is not the way to handle things. It's not try to shut something down that I believe God gave us, right? It's to have, and the other thing is, if you just try to manage somebody's desires and redirect them, you're still, the reason why I stopped doing that type of work is, number one, it sucks to work with someone that doesn't want to be there. They're just there, under duress. But the second thing is, I want to participate in a new vision of sexuality, which I believe society has been lacking, right? And if people had a vision of what is possible, right, then you can't just take away, like if someone is a food addict, you can't just take away the food and say, oh, you just got to be more strict with things. You have to give them a motivation for why, right? You have to give them something that is as satisfying or even more satisfying. So, and let me just say one more thing if I can. There is a Christian researcher in British Columbia at Lutheran University. When I had a podcast a long time ago, I interviewed him, and his idea, he's much more of an evangelical than I am, but his idea was, when there are some mentions in the Bible about fornication and lust and all of that, it's not so much to stop you having pleasure. It's to let you know that there is something available that's far better than just hooking up. And if you knew what was possible, you would put your energy there. And so he did the first studies that I know of about transcendent sex, like entering the psychedelic state, by interviewing different people that identify as Christian, couples who actually had a complete mystical experience, one could say being born again, through sex. And he did research by interviewing them. And so that has drawn me. That is much more interesting to me now. Long answer to your question, but I'll let you talk now.
Awesome. There was a lot of good things in what you said there. And I find it really interesting that there were cultures that didn't experience rape whatsoever. It's hard to believe, as you said, it'd be hard for a lot of people to believe. And it certainly is. I would like to know where the evidence for that would be, because it does seem to me that, if you look at war, times of war, and that appears to be a natural human thing, whether you go to tribal societies all the way up to, the great civilizations we have today, it's not uncommon for men to, assert their dominance as they're pillaging a village and taking it over, not only killing the men, but raping the women. So it seems to me that it's more of a base animalistic behavior. So I find it, I'm dubious to it, but I don't, not that I doubt it. It's just, I have my reservations as to whether or not, I just questions as to what the proof is for that. But I do agree with you when, you're saying that in today's world, there is this, this disconnect between men and women when it comes to sex, like the memes that you were talking about on Facebook, where, it's the men's fault, but then, I've heard also men say, well, women shouldn't be wearing that, which is this both wrong, that causes the issues. But anyway, so what then is the difference between, as you were talking about, when you have these spiritual these sexual moments in these tribes, these cultures, rather, that experience no rape, and so I guess where does the sacred sexuality come into play as opposed to just what people think of sex today? And I guess where's the disconnect in that, if that makes sense?
Sure. So let me just clarify one thing.
Mhm.
The Minangkabau people were a industrialized society, and you'd really need to read her whole book to get the whole in-depth research.
Mhm.
There's many aspects to it. Let me just say, one aspect is the creation myth of the culture. If the culture, like in Abrahamic religions, we have the Adam and Eve story, which basically, if you look at it, and I believe it was St. Augustine that talked about this, that the woman is the cause for the downfall of humanity. And because she ate the apple, right? And, the way the Bible is written, she should be cursed and have pain in childbirth and all of these things, right? Because she ate the apple. So there's this hatred of the woman, right? And need to suppress her as a sexual being because of this original story. And when cultures, one of the things that Peggy Sande noted was that when cultures have how like in marketing, Seth Godin or whoever talks about your story shapes your brand, right? It's the same thing in a culture, right? If there is a creation myth, even though we don't sit and chat with it, talk about this during the day, like nobody brings up the story of Adam and Eve normally, but it's in the collective unconscious, right? And when there is this woman causing the problem, right, then there's the justification for all sorts of abuse and stuff. But what she found was that unconscious justification. What she found is that different cultures that she identified in her book that had a creation myth, like everyone grew up to believe that this woman and this man, for instance, in one of the cultures, I can't remember the name of it, the woman and the man just emerged out of this volcano, and that's how civilization started. Like they have their own like little stories that they oral tradition that they tell all their kids, and everyone grows up to believe, oh, man and woman started, they popped up, and it wasn't like the woman did anything, or God was mad at them. It was like, it was, everything was equal and fine and harmony. And when there is that shaping of the original creation myth at the beginning, it sets a different foundation. That's just one aspect. Another aspect is that in these cultures, Minangkabau, they were industrialized, but a lot of the other ones, for instance, Renee Eisler talks about in her book, Chalice and the Blade, and other researchers have talked about as well, is there was a reliance on nature. So our agrarian societies, and there wasn't the capacity to store food. Once we could store food, then there was a warring for that surplus, right? But before we had that surplus to war about, and we were just living off of the land, then there was the realization that a woman's body, with the flow of blood and mirroring the cycles of the moon, and the birthing of new life, and just various reasons, they saw the woman as having an integral harmony with nature. And nature was, if you piss off nature, you're not going to eat, right? So there was this sense of, we have to honor the female, we have to honor the female sexuality, because that brings us in harmony with nature, and we're completely reliant on nature. And there's lots of cultures at those times where there was open celebration of sexuality. This Heros Gamos, sacred sexuality ritual, was practiced to access a higher state. The Ellucian Mysteries, I believe the inner mystery of the Ellucian Mysteries, there is indication that that was sex. They used psychedelics as some of it, but that it was actually sex. And what was known in the Ellucian Mysteries was that it's the most, without going to those initiation rites, it was talked about life is not worth living, right? I mean, it was a transformational event. So there's long history of sex and spirituality and the femininity being intricately connected. So that's that. But your other part of the question was about, could you restate it again?
Yeah. So basically, I guess what's the difference between like, what is sacred sexuality is the essence of what I was trying to get at with that question. Because you mentioned, you know, like in those cultures where there was no rape, there would be public sexual acts as well. Today, we would not see that as sacred. We would see that as inappropriate, and you know, some may even say demonic.
Right. So let's put aside the public aspect of it. Let's just talk about the whole framing of it, because a lot of the parallel here is with plant medicines and with psychedelics. And why do I say that? Because the most potent psychedelic known to humanity is called dimethyltryptamine, DMT. It is the hallucinogenic element in ayahuasca. So I've gone down to Peru and done ayahuasca with the shamans, and an ayahuasca experience lasts for about 6 to 8 hours, right? But if you take DMT itself, and Rick Strausman from the University of New Mexico has done the brunt of this work. He did it like quite a while back, and he wrote a book called A Spirit Molecule. And what he showed is that if you take DMT, it only lasts for 15 minutes, but it is far more potent than any other psychedelic. It actually transports you into another world. And this is where kind of string theory and everything kind of converges. There is some sense, there is some justification for the fact that you are entering this other quantum reality. And the point here being is we have that within our body. That DMT molecule is latent within our body. The precursors of it are in our lungs or in our brain. And what he hypothesized in his book, The Spirit Molecule, Rick Strausman, is that it is triggered when we are coming down the birth canal, not if we have a C-section birth. And that the moments before death, it's triggered. And then he went further to say that he believed it was also potentially during a certain kind of sex, like not the kind of just fucking that you would see in porn, right? But a certain kind of sex could trigger it. And that relates to the fact that I do believe ancient French people knew about this. And if you translate orgasm in the French language, it's le petit mort, which is the little death, right? And what we know from looking at all of the vast research on how plant medicines work on the brain is what they do is they shut down the default mode network of the brain, which is the task-oriented part of the brain, which is the part of the brain that gives you your sense of what you believe and how you identify and your ego, so to speak, right? And under the influence of a plant medicine, most drastically under DMT influence, that part goes quiet and the blood flow in the brain is redirected to other parts of the brain that are not normally interconnected. So you have this sense, there's the theory, I think it was Buckminster Fuller said that we never really experience what's available in reality. We're only experiencing what our consciousness is filtering. And that makes sense, because when you think about a dog can hear sounds we can't hear. Birds can see ultraviolet light that we can't see. So there is more out there that we are not accessing with our default mode network filtering it. But when we take the hallucinogenic, then we have an expanded view. And this is why people, for instance, Timothy Leary would give people psychedelics and take away their fear of death, because all of a sudden they had this expanded view of what was possible and they weren't afraid to die anymore, right? And why does Joe Rogan love DMT? He loves DMT because it gave, I mean, I can't speak for him, but it gave him a sense of being a part of something far grander. And what's interesting to me in some of this DMT research, I think that came out of London College, a huge percentage of people who identified it as atheists before they went into the psychedelic study and took the psychedelic, they ended that study and they did not identify as atheists anymore. They had to admit that there was something bigger. And especially with DMT, you're interacting with a, it could, could be benevolent, could not be benevolent. It depends on what you bring to it. But what they talk about repeatedly, if you've read Michael Pollan's book about plant medicines, what he talks about repeatedly, which is so important, is set and setting when you're taking a psychedelic. So you can take a psychedelic at a party and have a really bad trip and really freak out and actually have psychosis. So that's in the literature too. DMT was first studied with people that had schizophrenia. So you can have a bad trip and kind of lose it, right? But the way the way plant medicines were used in ancient cultures was by someone who, there was a level of initiation to kind of be at a place in your mind and body that you were ready to access something greater. And there was a context, there was a set, meaning there was the right mindset, the right intent, the useful intention, the mind that was prepared, right? And setting, meaning it was the right environment. There was a sacred container around it, right? It wasn't just some person doing it alone in their house with no guidance, right? Well, that exact same philosophy applies to sex. Like today, anyone can, get on any dating app and go and have sex in, an hour later with anybody and just, do it and do it very unconsciously. And it's like, okay, I've done that, no big deal, right? But you can learn about the capability that is latent within you, and you can approach it from a way that they almost parallel to how you approach a psychedelic in a sacred way, and apply this concept of mindset set and context setting. And this is where, when Rick Strassman said in his book, he believes DMT can be triggered by orgasm, this is where the potential exists, which the ancient French people knew when they said it's the little death, where your default mode network goes offline. And when it goes offline, it's called ego dissolution, ego death, right? And you feel like you are part of one with everything. You have this absolute lived spiritual experience, mystical experience. That is available through sex. And that is, from everything that I have looked at, put together, experienced, worked with women, I believe that the female body is particularly designed to access that altered state, and she can transfer that to her male partner during intercourse by certain practices too. And there's science behind that as well.
Yeah, the moon priestess, I think that's sort of what part of their healing process was actually some form of sexual acts.
The who? I'm sorry?
The moon priestess. There's a theory that Mary Magdalene was a moon priestess. Just, ancient stuff that appears to be resurfacing today, which is quite interesting. But before we go into why that may be it's resurfacing today, I would like to pick your brain as to why you think and when and why has this side of sexuality been suppressed? Because we're not very open about it in our society today. So what do you think is the cause for that?
Well, somebody wrote into my show recently and asked me about satanic ritual abuse. Mm-hmm. And it's unfortunate to say, but the average person walking around who believes in the higher power in a positive way doesn't have this sense that we're connected through this electromagnetic field, that there's biophotons within us which is light, which is electromagnetic energy, and that sex can actually activate this. And this whole concept is not really is thought of as woo-woo in the general culture, right? But when we're looking at how those who prey on people, like the people in the satanic ritual abuse, I do believe they're further ahead than us. I do believe that they know that there's this morphic field. They know that you can capture this light biophotonic energy from another person and feed off of it. And why do they use sex? And why do they predominantly use women? Is because they're feeding off that energy. And in the general culture, it has been just relegated to, oh, that's woo-woo. But what I have been interested in is, for instance, looking at the Freedom of Information Act. The CIA have been working on these things a long time. And so what, if you go to a university and you're, you know, talking about Rupert Sheldrake or something, although that's for a fringe thing, right? But that was talked about 60 years ago by the CIA. So I think there is a, not to be a conspiracy theorist, but I think there is a suppression of this information by elite forces in the world who use our ignorance of the average person thinks of sex as fucking and thinks of, okay, I just have this physical body and sex is just hooking up. That's all it is. They have no idea that if you know what you're doing, you can harness unseen energy, the kind of energy that Hitler was all about. Like Hitler was totally into the occult. And so, yes, you can take this energy, which is kind of, it was agnostic, right? And you can use it for evil purposes like Hitler, or as I talked about on my live stream yesterday, Nikola Tesla knew all about this energy. Now, he didn't use sex to get there, but he knew that there was this frequency that we could tap into and it had information in it. And we have been dumbed down. And anyone who has walked this earth who was really an enlightened being, I believe knew this. And for me, the epitome of that is Jesus. I believe that was his message. And I do believe Mary Magdalene was his equal in wife. And this is why the Gospel of Philip has been so captivating for me. It's certainly not, the words on the page don't jump off and speak literally to the left brain about what I'm speaking about. But if you use some decoding and filter it through what we know about the science of these things, it's all there. It's all there that he lived this, right? So I don't know if that answers your question.
In a way, yes. So what do you see the resurfacing that I mentioned in my question of this, sacred sexuality? Why do you think it's coming, manifesting itself in our world today?
Well, I think are you familiar with a book called The Immortality Key that came out recently?
Nope.
No?
No, sorry, I didn't know.
Okay.
Sorry.
No worries, no worries. So the person that wrote that book, he took about 10 years to put that book together. And his general premise is that psychedelics were used in early Christianity. And that early Christianity wasn't about following rules. It was about accessing a altered state of consciousness, a higher state of consciousness where you were merged with the divine. It was a lived experience. And I believe he's right, but I believe that's not the end of the story. I believe the other aspect of the story was that psychedelics were used to give people a reference experience for what sex could be, right? So he talks about in the Ellucian Mysteries, they drank kykeon, which was give you an altered state, and that happened for 2,000 years, the Ellucian Mysteries, which is the basis of our Western civilization, and that all ties into early Christianity. But we know that the Ellucian Mysteries were secret. But if you look at some of the early church fathers who criticized what was happening during those initiation rituals, they spoke about the sex. They spoke about the sexual sacraments. And there was the logo for my podcast is a female image where the genitals are being displayed, right? Which is an old image that was on Christian churches in the medieval time, right? But that also dates back to early Greece. This same image, Babo, was all over Eleusis, and that directly related to accessing higher states through the woman's body, through sacred sexuality. So with the immortality key, what the author of that book was talking about, in order for society to advance, we need to advance our state of consciousness. And he's purporting that plant medicines are the way. And I'm saying that plant medicines can be used how they were used previously. You give someone plant medicine so they know in their body, oh, okay, this is what it feels like. Now I know what it feels like, right? Then you initiate them into that sexually. Because if you're constantly dependent upon an external source for your connection to the divine, then you're not free. The only way that we're truly free is if we can access that without any, substance, right? And the other thing is we are hardwired for social connection. I think we all realize that through lockdown, right? Human beings don't do well when they're separated from other people. And we are hardwired for that. And sex has a lot of different, just good things for your mental health. But beyond that, it has this potential to access psychedelic states. So it makes total sense if we look at intelligent design in the universe, that this DMT would be ubiquitous in the plant kingdom, but also in the human body. So we would get access through plants to be able to know what it's like. But then it's not just to cut you off, it's to then realize, okay, I'm hardwired for social connection. Sex is beneficial to me in so many different ways, but sex doesn't just have to be physical. It can be, give me what I got from the DMT, right? And I mean, the other thing, if you do ayahuasca, for instance, you purge, you vomit, you have it coming out of you both ways, right? There's this purging. So you have to kind of pay the price for your transcendent state. Not so when we're talking about sexuality, right? Hopefully you're not vomiting and having diarrhea, right? But it gives you this reference state. And there's a book, I don't know if you've seen this, but it's called, I'm not trying to sell it, but it's called Recapture the Rapture. I just happen to have it on my desk here. And it's interesting. Jamie Wheel is talking about the fact that we're at this point in history that we're either going to end civilization. There's so many different things that could take us all out, right? Or that we're going to advance. We're at this point, we don't have a choice. We either got to shift into a higher state of consciousness or we're going to implode, right? And he talks about how the Christians think they're going to be raptured up by God. And and then he's saying that if you use psychedelics, then you can access this altered state. But he's also mentioning the transhumanist movement, that there is, the Elon Musk Neuralink whole thing, where we're going to be merged with machines and they're going to advance human beings because they're going to play God and say, oh, humans are, a lower technology. We're going to make you the next we're going to merge you with machinery to have a more advanced civilization. So there's this rush there's this push to find a way out of here. I mean, of course, Jeff and Bezos and the different people want to actually find a literal way out to Mars. But for the rest of us, there's a sense, okay, how can I advance? And this is where the immortality key comes in too, where you could actually transcend death. Well, there's a divine blueprint for how to do this. And I don't believe we were meant to be stuck in this level of consciousness where there's scarcity and there's fear of disease. Like, this is such a low level of consciousness where there's this divisiveness, racial wars. One of the things that happens when you do DMT is you have this sense that we are all connected. Race just falls away, because race is a filter from our default mode network, from our ego. So all of that falls away, right? Now, you can't live in that altered state all the time. You have to be able to, do your job and, work in the world. But the point being that if everyone had access to this unit of consciousness from time to time, we wouldn't have the wars, we wouldn't have the divisiveness, we wouldn't have the sense of greed. All of that would leave. Now, it sounds very Pollyanna, but there are people like Joe Rogan that have mentioned that. There are lots of different people that are proponents of psychedelics. I'm probably the only one out there saying, hey, we have this in our body. We don't just need to rely on the plant medicine. We actually were engineered to be able to access this without a plant medicine. Plant medicines aren't wrong, but it is our divine design to be able to activate this DMT. And, this is where the being able to see with the pineal gland, the third eye, and all of that stuff comes in too. So I believe it's imperative. I believe that one of the crises is, if you go into, looking at what's really going on in our world, one of the crises right now is the misuse of sexual energy. There is a lot of dark shit that's going on out there that elite people are doing, to steal energy, sex. I mean, that sounds like a real fabricated thing, but a couple of podcasts ago, I talked about a conference where social workers, psychiatrists, psychologists were all meeting to talk about satanic ritual abuse. It is a real thing. There are journal articles on it. It is a real thing, and it is an epidemic. And if we don't take back our power on that subject, if we don't learn that power is within us to be used for good, to be used to access a harmonious, altered state of consciousness, if we don't take back that knowledge, that wisdom, that, the book that Jamie Wheel had before this book was called Stealing Fire. And he talks about stealing this from the gods. We don't have to steal this from the gods. It's in us. It's in us. And we need to be able to experience that in order for us to advance to the next level of consciousness.
So essentially what you're saying is that sacred sex is a way to elevate one's consciousness. And with the assistance of psychedelics, in your opinion, it could be something to break the ice, if you will, but it's not necessarily something that we're dependent upon to continually transcend consciously or, remain in a more elevated state. If I'm understanding correctly.
Yeah, and I'm saying that not just from my personal opinion, but from what the initiation ceremony that's talked about all the time in the psychedelic community is the Ellucian Mysteries. Mm-hmm. And when I look at that through some feminist scholarship, I will say that, right? They do, but it's not just me making, looking at something that doesn't have grounding. There is a lot of indication that there were these sacred sexual rituals that were the inner mystery of this. And that's another rabbit hole I won't get into. But yes, I do see that as the whole possibility that exists for us. And for us to not realize this power that is within us. Here's the thing. Why aren't we more knowledgeable about this possibility for us to access this quantum state on our own without any help from anything on the outside. Well, if we were able to access this, if we all knew that power, we couldn't be controlled anymore. We would not be living in a dictatorship. There's no way, because we would, there's this level of mind control that's going on in the world today, which is MK Ultra-esque, which has been studied for a long time by government. If you go on Freedom Information Act, it's no, compassion is used against us. Oh, if you're not compassionate if you don't do this thing, for other people, right? And it's twisting of words and concepts. If you access this heightened state that I'm talking about with through sex, the DMT, those lies that exist in this MK Ultra, whole sphere, those are seen through. You have the ability. I mean, our pineal gland has photoreceptors like our physical eyes, right? And you actually can see in another dimension. You can actually see through just this illusionary world, right? Go past the matrix. Yep. And this is the epitome of spiritually waking up. And people are talking about this being the Great Awakening. I do believe this is the Great Awakening. And one of the greatest awakening is, so many people who come from the Christian tradition are told, oh, sex is bad, and, Jesus was celibate and his mother was celibate. That is refuted in the Gospel of Philip. It's totally refuted. And I believe the Vatican is sitting, the Vatican has miles and miles of books underneath their, underground or whatever. I believe this wisdom has been shut up for a long time. And it's time that this is going to be broken open, because when you suppress the truth, this is when distortion comes in. And it's no doubt that pedophilia is rampant in the Catholic Church, because they are holding on to the message that I believe is the truth. And the truth is, sex is not something, that is separate from your spirituality. Sex is the experience of the divine, right? So anyway, I can go into...
Well, no, that was very eloquently put, because that's where creation begins, right? In the way we know it. It's sex.
Well, here's the deal. So on Christian churches throughout Europe in the medieval times, there's this little figure. I don't have it in front of me to show you, but it's on the logo for my podcast. And she's holding open her, her genitals, right? This little figure, but her boobs are all saggy, right? And she's definitely not some young fertile thing. She's definitely kind of what they call the crone stage, right? And I think that was explicitly carved in stone like that. Why was explicitly carved in stone? That here she is, this sexual being. She was put above the entrance to the church and the entrance to the town, a lot of time, above the entrance of a castle. So the idea being, now if you Wikipedia this, you'll find the mainstream story that she represented lust and evil. That's bullshit. But if you look at some of the scholarship that comes from actually Ireland, then what you'll see is she represented female sexuality, representing the connection to the divine. And the reason why she was past childbearing years is to make the point, female sexuality is not just about producing a kid. That's not where all of the power comes from. The power comes from being able to access this state outside of fertility, right? And she was postmenopausal. And there's a book called Why Sex is Fun by Jared something. And he talks about, in all of the animal kingdom, human females are the exception, that they still have sexual desire, and all of that works after menopause. Most animals, they can be impregnated all the way up to death, right? But there is this sense of sex being separated from fertility. And so many in Christianity, it's okay, sex is okay if you're reproducing, but that's not it, right? What happens too, as part of this, I believe that women that were postmenopausal were initiated as priestesses and initiated into these Ellucian Mysteries and stuff, because you didn't have to worry about pregnancy. That's one thing, right? And the other thing is that so when we talk about ego dissolution, accessing this altered state, what's true is there's something called Kundalini Psychosis. So when you raise this energy, and I'll equate it to Kundalini, right? When you raise this energy in your body and you access this awakened state, if you're not fully grounded, know who the hell you are, know what your beliefs are, know what your identity is, feel confident in your skin, right? If you're kind of like not really sure of who you are, you can fuck yourself up. You can just go in. I mean, this is where multiple personality disorder comes in, or schizophrenia. So when that DMT gets tripped up during sex and you're not prepared for it, this is why I believe younger women weren't so much part of the mysteries. It was when you were older, when you were more grounded, where you knew who the hell you were. And so before you can have ego death, before you can dissolve the ego, you first have to have one. You can't dissolve an ego that you don't have, right? And when you're waffling and you're not really sure of your beliefs when you're younger and you're trying to people please this person, people please that person, and you're just kind of like floundering all over the place, that is not the time to access this awakened state. You first have to know who you are in order to access a greater sense. And this is what is all part of it.
So that sounds a little bit like the shadow that Carl Jung talks about. I know Alan Watts talks about this as well. And what it seems like is that a full integration of the self, of understand, like you're saying, understanding yourself, being grounded before taking on those, these experiences. And that makes a lot of sense when you're talking about the priestess being older, more mature. And that was interesting. I had no clue where that logo came from on your podcast. I thought it was very creative. I was like, okay, it catches your attention. Good marketing. It illustrates what you're going for with the show. But yeah, that's very interesting. And I want to talk a little bit about Jesus and Mary, as you mentioned earlier, that you think that their teachings, well, Jesus specifically, was more so geared towards this sacred sexuality. So maybe you can go into that a little bit.
Well, there's a book called Was Jesus Married by Walter Phipps, I believe. I believe he's an Episcopal priest. It's not something you could probably easily find, but when I was living in Arizona, I found it in the University of Arizona Library. And it gives pretty straightforward factual information about why he wouldn't have been respected in his day if he didn't have a wife. So that's that as a fact, right? But another book that actually was a paradigm shift for me that I came across in 1996 was a book called The Woman with the Alabaster Jar. And that kind of broke open my understanding of sexuality, my understanding of the Christian story. And just to summarize that very briefly, so the woman actually lives here in Washington State. She's retired now. But way back when, so she wrote the book in 1994, but even way before then, you might have heard the book Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which got a lot of press because of the Da Vinci Code. Well, that was a BBC special long ago where a few people wrote that, and they conjectured this whole idea that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene. They did a BBC special and they wrote this book. Well, a long time ago, this woman that wrote The Woman with the Alabaster Jar, someone gave her that book. Now here's Margaret, who is a staunch Christian, just a conservative Christian, and someone gives her this book. And she's disgusted, but she also wants to read it because she's doing a Master Divinity degree. And she wants to know what different views are out there. She reads the book, and when she's finished reading the book, she just wants to burn it. She thinks it's disgusting. She thinks that's not my Lord. That's not my Jesus Christ. That's wrong, right? But she started to have these dreams. She started to have different things that happened in her life that wouldn't let her let go of that story. And then what she decided to do, she decided to do her master's thesis in her Master Divinity program to put together a definitive book to refute that book. Because at the time, that book was capturing the attention of mass audiences. So she wanted to put together a definitive work to say, that's bullshit. He was not married. He definitely wasn't married to Mary Magdalene, some prostitute. Bullshit, right? So she put together, she She had all the time in the world. Her husband was in the military, so she was fully focused on this. And as she started to reach all these different places to construct her concrete evidence for this as much as you can, all of a sudden she started to realize, oh my God, I'm actually finding the opposite. I'm actually finding, oh wow, there's this suppressed fact, and there's this, and there's this, and there's this. And all of this stuff just started to bubble up in her research that actually pointed to that being true. And what happened, she tells in a kind of a memoir book that she has, later book, that her husband actually put her in a mental asylum for a period of time when she was working on this research. Because imagine a woman who loves the celibate Jesus Christ story, it's her whole life. Mm-hmm. And she's doing this in service of him to refute this story, and she's finding the opposite. And it's just, she's losing her mind. And what is so crushing to her is she had all her faith in the church, and she said, how could I have been lied to? She just couldn't believe it. So she spent the time in the mental asylum, and then she's like, this book, this is just too traumatic for me. I got to put this aside. I cannot work on this anymore. But things kept coming to her, like information, people kept, things kept showing up in her life. Mm-hmm. And she's like, okay, what do you want me to do? And what was happening is she couldn't get peace of mind anymore when she pushed the project away. She lost all of her peace of mind. The only time she had peace of mind was when she resumed work on it. And one day she looked at the Bible, because the Bible was like her source, right? And she said, okay, I'm just going to throw out this Bible, and God, this has torn me up inside. If you please give me peace of mind, like tell me what to do. Should I continue on with this or not? And she opened up the Bible, and she just closed her eyes and she put her finger on something, and it said, restore my bride. And I've heard Margaret in person speak in seminars years ago. And it's hard to listen to her and not have some emotional impact, because she still has emotional impact. And how she interpreted those words was Jesus Christ saying, my bride has been misaligned. She's been said that there's this story which has been recanted by the church that she was a prostitute. They say they made it up, but so many people have believed it all along. It's kind of almost too late, right? But restore my bride, that she wasn't the prostitute, that she was my equal and even my teacher, right? And so this is when Margaret had the energy to finish her book called The Woman with the Alabaster Jar. And it's a scholarly book. And in there, she makes the case that there's a story in the Bible. The woman is unnamed, but there's this woman that washes Jesus's feet and anoints him with this expensive perfume. And the apostles say, why are you wasting that expensive perfume on her? It could fed the poor, all the money for that. And he said, let her alone. What this woman has done has prepared me for my burial. And what she has done, I think this is in Gospel of Mark, what she has done shall be preached in all of the Gospels, right? And so Margaret Starbird, in her book, she dives really deep into that passage in the Bible, really, really deep. And what she basically says is that was a sexual ritual. That was a sexual ritual. Mary Magdalene was having sex with Jesus, and this whole thing about being born again, I'm an evangelical, I'm born again. Well, there is a rebirth of consciousness that happens, the reborn, right? So when I'm talking about psychedelics, they shut down your default mode network and you have an access to more. That's a rebirth, right? And so when Mary Magdalene had sex with Jesus in this very sacramental way, that's the word anointed means Christ in Greek language, right? Christ is translated as anointed. So when she anointed him, she brought him to this higher state. And when he died, and then, the resurrected, he's walking around in his light body kind of thing. Mm-hmm. That's when he was able to transcend the physical realm and enter the quantum realm. And that's why, he was able to show up in his light body, his biophotons, right? The electromagnetic energy that's in our body. He was at a certain frequency where he could, in India, you have people that can walk through walls. That's because they have raised their frequency to a certain point where they're no longer just the material, physical. They can actually go back and forth, like Einstein said equals MC squared, that back and forth between physical and energy. And so what Margaret was saying in her book was that anointing, what made Christ, what made him not just Jesus, this dude, but this Christ, person that's able to, show up in his light body, was that she elevated his consciousness through sex. And it was akin to like a DMT rebirth. So she doesn't use DMT. She doesn't say it in the words I've said it, but that's what's, I've read that book in 1996 and it started me on this journey.
Wow, that's really interesting. I never heard the perspective of that being a sexual act that was taking place between Jesus and Mary. I heard from, I believe his name is Lars Moll. I think he's Danish. He's a mystic. He talks about Mary Magdalene and Jesus. And he talks about that particular story that you were mentioning where Jesus has his feet being washed and being anointed, that this was actually demonstrating the equality of Mary and Jesus in that moment. That's what I've heard, other than the traditional, view that it wasn't anything special. It just is what it says it is in the Bible. But that's very interesting that it was a sexual act. Now,
well, the thing is, how people are talking about I don't know if I'm going down a rabbit hole, but stop me if I am. But people are talking about the Freemasons are evil, and the Knights Templar and the Masonic Temple are evil. Well, yeah, there's probably evil in there now. I would probably agree with that. But it didn't start out that way. I have a dissertation from a scholar at Cambridge University who is probably the only person in the world that agrees with me on, Margaret Starboard, tricked me off on all of this.
And you took one of her workshops, didn't you? I think I heard that in one of your podcasts that.
I used to live in Tucson. I traveled up to Seattle to see her back in 1905. And then once I moved up here, I spent a lot of time with her, got to know her personally, went to her house and stuff. And so I spent quite a bit of time with her. And I actually asked her, I said, why aren't you going to take this story and extrapolate it out to human beings and sacred sexuality? And she looked at me and she goes, maybe that's your job. So that was a long time ago. And I kind of put that on the back burner. And now it seems like it's the time. But
you were going on the Masonic Temple.
Oh yeah, no worries. So here's the thing. No one talks. Okay, let's face it, right? If you're in Yale University, if you're in Harvard, if you're in any of the traditional schools, you are not going to write about the Gospel of Philip being about Jesus being sexual. You're just not going to do it, right? You're going to lose your tenure. You're going to it's not acceptable, right? So you have to go with the party line narrative. I think we're all figuring that out. There's a sanctioned narrative, and that's it, right? And listen, if we believed we could access God directly, why do you need a church? Why do you need hierarchy, right? If we believed our body, if there's another thing you see in the Gospel of Philip, it's not that we're sinful. It's not that we have this darkness in us. No, it's that we have light within us that we just need to become aware of and access it, right? So we're not these sinners, right? And the body is not bad. The body is not to be overcome. It's through the body that we access the divine. And that is unique. Even in Tantra, if you look at Tantra, at a certain point, you're supposed to become celibate. When you reach a certain level in Tantra, you're supposed to become celibate. Sex is only used to get you to a certain level. That is not what the Gospel of Philip is saying. The Gospel of Philip has lines in there that read that the holiest of the holies is the bridal chamber, and the bridal chamber is sacred sex, right? You have to be able to decode it. But anyway, there's this woman that I found after a long period of time who wrote this dissertation as part of her master's degree. She's not a tenured professor or anything, but she did go to Cambridge University in England. And she wrote about this kind of validating what I'm saying here. And one of her lines in there is that I think she said, this is actually what Christianity is about. Christianity, the true Christianity, is about sex as prayer. Like sex is higher. That is Christianity. She writes that in her thing. But she also quotes this book where this guy talked about Knights Templar, Freemasons, what's the other one? Masons, right? Which there's a thread that runs through all of them. And he's linking these things up to the Jesus Mary Magdalene marriage story, right? That the sacred secret knowledge that these folks were holding was that Mary Magdalene was this, sacred, divine, connection for Jesus. And it was through the equality, right? She wasn't going to do it on her own, but he wasn't going to do it without her either. It was through this union of the two that this was possible, right? But that the Knights Templar were holding this information. That's what they were secretly guarding. This was the Holy Grail information, right? This was the Ark of the Covenant. The Gospel of Philip talks about the Ark of the Covenant, the holiest of the holies, like the most secret thing is this sexual merging, right? Is this, this is what the great work is in alchemy. Mary, we talk about Hermes and stuff, but there is Mary the Jewess that actually came before that about alchemy, and the sexual imagery in there, it speaks to the fact that it was sex, and she's related. There's a line through to her, to Mary Magdalene. But anyway, when it comes to Freemasons, Masons, Knights Templar, they all had one thing in common, according to some of these people that I'm talking about, that they held this secret story, because if this was really discovered, it would shatter Western civilization, that the lie that Jesus was celibate, the lie that our bodies are evil and we have to overcome them, the lie that God is up in the heavens and not within us. All of those lies, our society as we know it today would crumble, because we are not powerless beings trying to pray to a God in the sky that may or may not be in a good mood that day and reward us or not, or punish us. No, we are these beings that can enter this divine state at will, through sacred sexuality. The reason why we have this urge to, connect with another person in that way, to have a partner, to have that relationship, is because it's part of our divine blueprint, right? And I do believe that, there's so much darkness that's been talked about with pedophilia and the Masons and, satanic rituals and Freemasonry and all this stuff, is because anywhere there is light, anywhere there is truth, anywhere there is the presence of God, it's going to be attacked by the dark side, and it's going to be subverted. And it's unfortunate to me that I hear my Christian brothers and sisters getting on, podcasts and getting on different places and saying, oh, this is evil. This, image of the third eye is evil. It is not evil. It is not evil. It's being used in demonic ways now, but that's not what the original thing. And the original, and I believe the original hidden secret knowledge was about sacred sexuality and Jesus and Mary Magdalene.
Yeah, what you were saying about the third eye, the first thing I think about is in the Bible, I think it's in Matthew maybe, where Jesus says that the way to see is through the inner, the eye that light, if your eye is clean, it's just singular, not plural, which, implies the third eye. I've heard some call it it's your first eye, because it's how you perceive the world is through, I don't know why I can't pronounce it, but the pineal gland or whatever. Now, with the sacred sexuality, the other thing that we see too is obelisks, a lot of obelisk, and that's a representation of a phallus. And a lot of people aren't aware of that. And that goes all the way back to like Egyptian culture, probably even further back. But the thing that also used to be talked about a lot was the Holy Grail. And what a lot of people don't realize as well is that the Holy Grail is, is symbolic for the female parts, the vagina. And what, we see too, I think in I think it's the Gospel of Thomas, is this where Jesus talks about being, I don't know if he actually says with Mary in there, but teaching people how to connect with not only his disciples were mostly men. So connect not only, with your divine masculine, but with your divine feminine. And so what I'm getting at with this is that there are certain archetypes that are just left out in our world today. And I think that handicaps society into what you're saying, because essentially, if I'm understanding correctly, is that there's this suppressed knowledge to prevent people from truly knowing who they are. It's keeping us away from our true selves. And part of that is through this polarization of sex, this divide between it. But as you've been touching on in antiquity, there were a lot of peculiar ways to manifest these ways of worship. Like you mentioned the Christians. A lot of people are unaware that the early Christians, like I believe they're called Ophite Christians. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but they would have ceremonies in which they would consume menstrual blood and also, what the semen as well. That was like the wine. The wine was considered the menstrual blood. That's why it's called the Holy Grail. And all of these things appear to be more accepted today than maybe they would have been 100 years ago. But yeah, I'm not sure if you have any reflections on what I just said there.
Yeah. So I think the biggest problem we have is that we have this information hidden. The Gospel of Philip was found in Nag Hammadi in 1945, wrapped in the Gospel of Thomas. So there's a lot of compatibility there. But the Gospel of Philip is the one that goes into more of the erotic nature of the transcendent state. And the problem that I see is that when you have vilified the body, when the church has vilified the body, when you have seen sex as the opposite of accessing a spiritual state, right? So there's a lot of young people today that want spirituality. They're hungry for that spiritual experience. And there's a lot of people that are saying, I'm not going to have anything to do with dating. I'm not going to have anything to do with any kind of sexual activity because I want to be spiritual. So there's like this, I've seen this going on, that there's still this misunderstanding. And the other thing that happens is, look at someone like Aleister Crowley, who unfortunately, some people hold him up as an image of enlightened guy, a lot of, I think the Rolling Stones, different musicians just really saw this guy as a guru. But this guy was satanic, right? 4 of his mistresses suicided themselves. I mean, I think that they just went insane and probably did that. And then he had 2 wives, and they both ended up in mental hospitals. So this guy was dark, right? But what was he a product of? He was a product of a fundamentalist Christian home. So he has said in his writings that he was going to do anything he could to piss off God in his life. So he went off the deep end in sex, right? And there's nature abhors a vacuum, right? So when there isn't this vision, when the vision that Jesus and Mary Magdalene actually gave us, but that's been suppressed, it's been held secret, when that has been suppressed all this time, if you have this energy within your body and you have no vision that is spiritual, there's a lot of people that are willing to show you the way that have really dark information, dark intention. And that's what's captured our music today. You know, that's what's captured, you know, I'm not somebody that's uptight about music, but like there's a lot of dark shit out there. You know, it's just, it's like programming. And here's the thing, people think that there's the only way to have a good time in sex is to do something forbidden or is wrong. Well, you have to take the whole idea of wrong and forbidden out of the picture. There's either bringing you to the light or bringing you to darkness, right? And going to the light is not a boring kind of puritanical sexual experience. It's the most passionate, wild, exciting experience.
And I'm sorry to interject here, but what is the difference though between, you know, you've been mentioning this quite a bit, is like the satanic abuse. I know you just did an episode on that. I saw it on your podcast, and the light. So like this dark side of sexuality and the light side of sexuality. What's the distinction?
That's probably an hour answer, but let's just, I'm trying to get a succinct way to answer you. Okay, so I mean, there's two different components. Like, so you have to look at the person who's perpetrating the satanic thing and the person that's a recipient, right? For the perpetrator, yes, they steal energy, right? You know, whether they kill the person, torture the person. When you're near the death experience, the DMT is going to trip up in the body. And this is where the cannibalism comes in. I mean, satanic ritual abuse includes eating the person, right? So, there's like, but there's this constant sense, not always, but it can, right? But there's this constant sense that you have to search for the energy from another person. You're never really maintaining that energy in your body because you're living at such a low frequency. When you inflict harm on another person and torture on another person, you're living at like the lowest frequency, and you are constantly needing to steal energy from people all the time. And when you're the recipient of that abuse, if you stay alive, then what usually happens is the Kundalini what can happen is the Kundalini psychosis that I mentioned earlier. And that is when something that is so jarring to the nervous system happens, there's a splitting off. And this is where the person may not even have any conscious memory that it happened, right? They just have two different aspects of their personality. Hitler liked to use people that had been sexually tortured or incested because he knew that would produce multiple personalities in an individual. He could have one person go out and commit a crime for him, and then the other aspect within them didn't even know they committed the crime, right? So it splits off a person and creates a person that's not functioning in full capacity, right? When we're talking about accessing this DMT state through consensual, loving sex, what we're talking about, first of all, is realizing that a woman's body is set up for this, but you can't freak her out. You can't, like, there has to be, and here's the thing, her body has a sense of, there's research to show that your body will register the intention of the person even before your mind registers it. So the body knows if the person has ill intention towards you. Now, there might be lubrication that happens, right? But that doesn't mean that the woman is ready for sex or is going to be in an optimal state for sex. Lubrication can happen in the vaginal canal just because it's a preparation for, so you don't get ripped during a rape, right?
Like,
but that doesn't mean that
in a way.
That doesn't mean that the woman is aroused at all. So what you need, because the woman's sexual organs, her cervix being the most profound orgasmic part of this whole psychedelic state, connects to the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the primary nerve pathway in the parasympathetic nervous system. And so it is also the pathway in the body that is known as the mind-body connection. So when we talk about the body having influence over the mind, like if your gut is all messed up with bad bacteria, you can be depressed, right? And so they're starting to treat probiotics for people that have depression. They're realizing the body can influence the mind, because the vagus nerve, it is a two-way pathway between the body and the brain. And 80% of the communication runs up from the body to the brain rather than down. So the brain is not the command central fully when it comes to this vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is sending information to the brain. That means that with a woman, there has to be a mind-body connection that happens to a much greater extent than a man. So when we talk about, her feeling connected to you, like appreciated by you, desired by you, physically and emotionally safe with you, right? Trusting of you. In the Gospel of Philip, they talk about the prerequisites being a state of consciousness and a state of trust. So consciousness being, you're not there just to have, same with psychedelics, right? The sense of intention. So you're not there just, okay, what can I take from her? How can I use her and have a good time, right? There's a consciousness about that. So you're there to be as much for that person's well-being as much as for your own. And you're not there just for some kind of genital satisfaction. You're there for an experience that can actually alter all of you. So this is why in ancient times, people went through a mystery school. They went through levels of initiation, because when you access this DMT power, it's fucking powerful, right? Why are so many people after this? This is what I believe Satanists are after. They're after the DMT because it gives you access to what Hitler wanted, which is access to this realm that's filled with angels and demons, this realm that's filled with entities. And if you think I'm speaking woo-woo, just read some of the DMT trip reports. People speak about talking to entities, right?
Like machine elves, clockwork elves, I believe, are one of the main figures that people see.
What's that?
The clockwork elves. I've heard that from like Terrace.
Well, I mean, that depends on who you're talking to. Yeah, it depends on, I mean, people bring in their preconceived ideas too, right? It's filtered through their ideas, but I mean, that's the realm of power. And to access that state, in a state that actually, you know that it's not a satanic state, and you know that it's this sacred sexuality with how you are after the fact, right? So in a satanic, you're fucking crushed. You're like, your mind is, you're lost, you are lost. And, they've hired more exorcists at the Catholic Church, and 80% of the people that they're doing exorcisms on are people that have been sexually abused, because you become porous to this really dark energy when you have one of those rituals happen to you, right? And unbeknownst to you, you're completely innocent, but this happens, right? So you are messed up after a satanic ritual. But after this sacred sexual experience where you have this DMT rising, you are changed, as if you had, people talk about going up to the mountains, and, there's gurus that live for 20 years and meditate, and then they reach this sense of, oh, I'm one with everything and I'm divine. Now, I'm not saying you're going to get that the first time you have one of these DMT experiences through sacred sexuality, but you get a level of that experience. In fact, Andrew Newberg has written a book that talks about enlightenment, and he talks about the same area of the brain that lights up with someone who's meditated for decades and entered a mystical state as someone who's able to access this mystical state through sex. It's the same part of the brain that lights up, right? So what you know is how you are afterwards. Do you feel like fully empowered? Are you fully in your body? As opposed to in a satanic ritual, you are disassociated, right? Are you fully in your body? Are you feeling more empowered? Not empowered I'm confident I have a good ego, but empowered from a source that's beyond you. And this is where it becomes so pivotal to us as a civilization, because if you're sourcing your power from your ego and you lose your job, you feel like shit for a while, right? Or, you lose your stock market, you lose your investments, people commit suicide, right? If partner walks away from you, you feel crushed, right? But if you're sourcing not from your ego, and this is what all the mystical traditions are trying to teach us, if you're sourcing from an energy that's coming through you from beyond you, that is all power, the kind of power that Hitler wanted, if you're sourcing from that all power, then, you can be fired, but that's not your identity. You can lose your partner, but that's not your identity. You can lose your income, but you know that you can tap into source, and you have the ability to bring, like Nikola Tesla could bring something from the unseen to the seen. You have the ability to tap into that. You become so friggin' powerful. No dictator, no government can tell you what to do, because you have access to not earthly power, but to true power. And that is what is possible. That's the difference between sacred sexuality and the satanic.
So would you say that in today's world, in America, United States specifically, that the sexual environment is sort of festering with just that dark energy?
Well, I don't personally watch porn, because why? I don't want to watch someone do something. I want to do it myself, right? But anytime I have a Twitter feed, and before, people used to, until I started blocking some people, they used to send me all sorts of imagery, and I'm like, holy fucking shit, the way that they portray women on these things, it just makes me want to puke, right? And that's not, if you want to have a DMT experience with a woman, you don't treat her like that, right? She's not a slave to dominate in that way, right? When you look back at the mystery schools and the ancient, how they would initiate people to this, it was always the woman's body being something that was held in reverence, right? And so, pornography is not bad. Promiscuity is not bad. It's how you approach it, right? Are you approaching it music today? It has the same theme. How can I get what I want? How can I use you and throw you away like, a wrapper off fast food? It's all usury. It's all ego. And it's such a low vibration. It keeps us stuck in a low vibration. It's not about right and wrong and sin and good. It's not. It just gets us stuck in a low vibration. And if we want to really access true power and raise our vibration, it's not about using someone so that you can just get off for a moment, because just getting off and orgasming just in a physical way is always gonna, I don't necessarily believe in the whole idea of sexual addiction anymore, but to a certain extent, there is some plausibility for it. And that is, if you're just running on this dopamine hit of, masturbating to porn, for instance, there is an addictive cycle that can run through the body and brain where you just need that next dopamine hit. But when you're going to a very deeper state, when you're starting off with more of a deeper state of mind to begin with, then you're actually not just going to the dopamine receptors. The DMT works on the serotonin receptors. And what we know about psychedelics is they're not addictive. They are not addictive. So when you access the DMT with the serotonin receptors, you're not accessing addictive sex. You're accessing transcendent, transformative sex, but not the kind of sex that's going to keep you in this kind of addictive cycle. So I don't think there's much understanding of that today. And I don't think it's because people are bad or people are, have no morals. I don't think that at all. I just think it's that the information has been withheld from people. You know, right now there's millions and millions of dollars that's being thrown at psychedelic research, and it's being heralded that psychedelics are going to offer the breakthrough for people in mental health. You'll take a psychedelic, you'll go to a trained therapist who can integrate the experience with you, and then you're going to be able to have all these breakthroughs in addiction, PTSD, and all of these things. But there's a lot of money to be made at that. That's why Silicon Valley is throwing their money that way, because there's like, but where's the money of teaching someone, teach a man to fish, right? Where's the money in teaching someone to access the DMT without having to buy it from a pharmaceutical company? Because that's where it's going. You're going to get your psilocybin
Right.
and your DMT from a pharmaceutical, right? They're taking that over, corporatizing it. But where's the research of showing us how to do this ourselves? Because if we knew how to do it ourselves, we wouldn't need to rely on big pharma. We wouldn't need to rely on this big capitalistic structure that's, you know, kind of overtaking plant medicines right now. So this is how we get liberated, is realizing that this is a possibility that exists in all of us all the time, but we have to kind of re-envision sex and look at it in a different way, you know. And I believe everybody has the capability to access the state in their body. They do.
Right. Well, that would make sense going with what you're saying, and I really like what you're saying as far as, you know, we have the potential within us as opposed to looking for something external, because that never really appealed to me. It never resonated to me with as truth. It always, you know, what always resonated with me is that, you know, you have that within you. It's more empowering.
Well, because as soon as a big pharma controls plant medicines, they can control whether you're going to be able to get access to it or not.
Exactly.
Right? They can withhold it from you. Just like, you know, people who don't take the vaccine now are not going to be able to get medical procedures. You know, they have the control. But when we realize we have the power within us, you know, this is when there's the revolution, right? This is when society is taken back.
There's also talks of breakaway civilizations and things of that nature, which would be in line with what sort of you're talking about and what I've heard before too. And I tend to agree with, but when you hear the breakaway civilizations, it's more so for the elite, but it doesn't have to be necessarily, with just the rising in consciousness and being more in tune with the power inside of us. And that's what your work's all about. And, you know, if I'm not mistaken, you do private consultations to help people, you know, achieve these states and just reach higher levels of consciousness. And, you know, as I told you through our various communications, that I think the work you're doing is much needed right now. And, you know, but it's a difficult topic to talk about because either, you know, it's like, it's just in our culture, you know, just the topic of sex, as we've been talking about already, is not something many people will openly talk about, but it's what got all of us here. You know, it's a beautiful thing, and it holds a lot of power within it. You know, and you touch on that a lot, and I appreciate the work that you do. It's very, you know, educational, a lot of information inside of it, a lot of knowledge. So, Dr. Martin, where can people find your work and maybe get in contact with you and just, you know, stay up to date on what you're doing?
Sure. Well, you can find me at drjennymartin.com, drjennymartin.com. And from there, you can find the podcast, Why Didn't I Know Podcast, which is on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, all the different places. And we've just started YouTube Live, weekly YouTube Live. So the podcast is now on YouTube at Why Didn't I Know channel. And that just started a week or two ago. So that'll be weekly as well if you want to watch your podcast instead of downloading it. So I welcome questions that I will cover topics that people submit, and I will cover them in the podcast.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for coming on the show. And I'll be sure to put the link, all the links to your website, to your podcast, YouTube channel in the description of the video here.